Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
The hidden power of the woman who no longer chases isn't that she becomes impossible to reach. It's that one day, the silence she leaves behind becomes louder than every message she ever sent. And by the time he finally hears it, she's no longer waiting to be understood. People always seem to notice the day she stops reaching out. They almost never notice the hundreds of days before that. The mornings she woke up wondering whether today would be different. The afternoons she stared at a message that simply said, "I'm busy," and somehow convinced herself that maybe tomorrow he'd have more room for her. The nights she lay in bed with her phone face down on the mattress, only to flip it over every 7 minutes, like maybe the universe had changed while she wasn't looking. It's strange what the human mind can normalize when it loves someone. You tell yourself you're being patient. You tell yourself they're just overwhelmed. You tell yourself they're not good at expressing emotions. You tell yourself a lot of things. Mostly because the alternative hurts too much. I used to think women stopped chasing because they became stronger. Now, I'm not even sure that's the first thing that happens. I think they just become tired. Not dramatic tired. Not the kind where someone announces they're leaving. The quieter kind. The kind that settles into your bones after asking the same emotional question in 100 different ways. Are we okay? Did I do something wrong? Are you pulling away? Can we talk? Eventually those questions stop coming out of your mouth. Not because you suddenly know the answers. Because you're exhausted from hearing silence answer them every single time. And silence has a strange way of making you doubt your own reality. Sometimes he wasn't even cruel. That's what made it confusing. He'd disappear for 2 days. Then come back with, "Hey," like nothing had happened. Like 48 hours of wondering where you stood was somehow a normal Tuesday. And she'd reply, because what else was she supposed to do? She missed him before she finished being angry. That's one of those embarrassing truths people don't like admitting. Sometimes love makes your pride leave the room before your common sense does. I remember watching someone, I won't even say whether it was me or someone close to me, sit on the edge of a kitchen counter at almost midnight. The dishwasher was still running. The house smelled faintly of dish soap and leftover coffee. Her phone lit up. His name. Just one message. "Sorry, crazy week." She smiled. Actually smiled. Then immediately hated herself for smiling. Because part of her knew. That wasn't really an apology. It was access. Just enough attention to keep the door unlocked. She answered anyway. Not because she was weak. Because hope is strangely practical. Hope says, maybe this time. Hope isn't always beautiful. Sometimes it's just repetitive. You can almost hear it whispering. Don't overreact. He's trying. He texted. He came back. As if coming back after disappearing deserves applause. The strange thing is, no one sees how many tiny disappointments stack together. People only notice the final silence. They don't notice the hundreds of little moments that built it. The conversation she carried by herself. The dates she planned. The difficult conversations she softened so he wouldn't feel cornered. The jokes she laughed at even when she wasn't really laughing anymore. The paragraphs she rewrote because she didn't want to sound too emotional. She became fluent in making herself smaller. Not because anyone asked her to. Because she slowly learned that expressing too much seemed to push him further away. So she adjusted. Then adjusted again. Then one day. She couldn't remember what her unedited feelings sounded like. That's the part people rarely talk about. You don't lose yourself all at once. You lose yourself sentence by sentence. Deleted draft by deleted draft. Unasked question by unasked question. Until one afternoon you open your messages. Type everything you've been holding inside. Read it twice. Delete the entire thing. Lock your phone. Walk into the kitchen. Start wiping a counter that's already clean. Your body suddenly needs something to control because your heart doesn't feel controllable anymore. It's funny, or maybe sad, how emotional overwhelm sometimes looks exactly like productivity. Cleaning, laundry, organizing drawers. Anything that keeps your hands busy enough to stop reaching for someone who isn't reaching back. I've seen people mistake that for healing. It isn't. Not yet. It's survival wearing clean clothes. Sometimes she'd still check when he was online. Not because she expected him to message. Because uncertainty hurts less when it's moving. Seeing the little green dot somehow felt better than imagining the worst. Even if he was online talking to everyone except her. Isn't that strange? How we negotiate with crumbs. How the nervous system accepts almost contact because complete absence feels unbearable. Then something subtle begins to happen. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Nothing explodes. Nothing ends with a speech. She simply stops asking. He doesn't even notice at first. That's the heartbreaking part. He thinks everything is calmer. Less emotional. Less pressure. He tells himself, this is better. Meanwhile, she's not calmer. She's quieter. Those aren't the same thing. Quiet can mean peace. But quiet can also mean resignation. The silence sounds identical from the outside. Inside, they're worlds apart. There's this moment, I don't know exactly when it arrives, where she reaches for her phone. And stops. Not because she's playing a game. Not because she's waiting for him to chase her. She just doesn't have another version of the same conversation left inside her. That realization is strangely physical. Your thumb hovers over his name. Your chest feels tight. You unlock the phone. Lock it again. Walk away. Come back 5 minutes later. Unlock it. Read old messages instead. Not to torture yourself. To remind yourself that it wasn't always this hard. Or maybe to convince yourself it wasn't. Memory edits things. Especially when loneliness becomes the narrator. Then one night she catches herself laughing. Not because of him. Because of something completely unrelated. A friend says something ridiculous over dinner. She laughs so hard she forgets to check her phone for almost an hour. When she finally remembers, there isn't that familiar panic anymore. Just, oh, it's such a tiny moment. Most people wouldn't even notice it. But emotionally, that might have been the beginning of the end. Not the end of loving him. The end of organizing her entire emotional life around whether he responded. There's a difference. A painful one. She still misses him. Sometimes terribly. She still wonders what he's thinking. She still replays conversations in the shower. She still imagines different endings while driving home after work. None of that disappears overnight. But something inside her stops volunteering for disappointment. It's almost impossible to explain unless you've lived it. Because from the outside, it looks like she became distant. Inside, it feels more like someone finally setting down a suitcase they've been carrying long after their hands went numb. And here's the uncomfortable part. The part one still wrestle with. Sometimes the man looks at her silence and thinks, see, she never really cared. Because if she cared, wouldn't she keep trying? Wouldn't she fight harder? Wouldn't she send one more message? One more explanation? One more chance? Maybe. Or maybe that final silence wasn't the absence of love. Maybe it was simply the moment love became too heavy to carry alone. There's a quiet sentence that never gets spoken out loud. Not between them. Not even to herself. It sounds something like this. I still love you. A pause. I just can't keep proving it by myself anymore. And somehow, those two sentences can exist at exactly the same time. There's something painfully ordinary about the way people begin taking someone for granted. It rarely starts with arrogance. It starts with familiarity. The first few times she waits up for him, he notices. He thanks her. He apologizes for being late. He tells her she's sweet. A few months later, she's still waiting. Only now, it's become part of the furniture. Like the lamp that's always on when he gets home. Like the coffee she somehow remembers he likes without asking. Like the drive-safe text that arrives before every long trip. At some point, love quietly becomes expected. Not because it loses value. Because the human brain adjusts to consistency frighteningly fast. We adapt to kindness almost immediately. Its absence. That's what shocks us. Not its presence. And maybe that's where everything slowly begins to drift. Because she mistakes consistency for commitment. And he mistakes consistency for permanence. Those sound similar. They're not. Not even close. I remember someone once saying, I never thought she'd actually leave. Not because she threatened to. Because she never did. She stayed through misunderstandings. She stayed through canceled plans. She stayed through birthdays that felt strangely lonely even when they celebrated together. She stayed after arguments that ended with him saying, I just need some space. She always gave him space. Then welcomed him back as if the distance hadn't quietly bruised something inside her. After enough repetitions, his nervous system learned something dangerous. Not consciously. Almost like muscle memory. No matter how emotionally unavailable he became, she would eventually restore the connection. He didn't sit there thinking, I can neglect her. It was subtler than that. His body simply stopped fearing loss. Because loss had never happened before. There's a strange confidence that grows inside people who have never had to experience someone's absence. Not confidence in themselves. Confidence in access. The access becomes invisible. He could disappear for a weekend. She'd check in. He could forget to call. She'd call first. He could leave a conversation unresolved. She'd circle back the next morning. Without realizing it, she became the emotional bridge every single time. And bridges have a funny problem. Nobody admires them while they're standing. People only notice them after they've collapsed. Sometimes I wonder if he even realized how much invisible work she was doing. Probably not. Most emotional labor leaves no evidence. Nobody applauds the conversations that prevented bigger fights. Nobody notices the nights someone cried in the bathroom before coming back into the living room smiling because they didn't want to make things worse. Nobody sees the drafts that never got sent. The words swallowed. The questions postponed. The disappointments quietly folded into tomorrow. He only experienced the finished version. The easier version. The softer version. The version she edited before handing it to him. There's an honesty that still makes me uncomfortable. Sometimes. She protected him from the consequences of his own emotional inconsistency. She translated his silence into stress. His distance into exhaustion. His withdrawal into confusion. She kept giving his behavior kinder explanations than he was giving himself. Maybe because believing he cared was easier than believing he simply wasn't showing up. Or maybe both were true. That's the difficult part. Human beings are rarely one thing. He probably did care. He also probably kept choosing comfort over difficult conversations. Those two realities can exist together. Love doesn't automatically make someone emotionally brave. Sometimes it makes them more avoidant. Because suddenly there's something they could actually lose. So instead of leaning closer, they drift sideways. Not all at once. Just enough to keep from feeling too exposed. It's almost embarrassing how ordinary avoidance looks. It doesn't always sound like, I don't love you. Sometimes it sounds like, I'm just really tired. This week has been crazy. I'll call you tomorrow. We're okay. Nothing dramatic. Nothing technically wrong. Just enough distance to slowly starve intimacy without anyone naming it. Meanwhile, she keeps feeding the relationship, almost automatically. She remembers his mother's birthday. She asks how the meeting went. She notices when his voice sounds different. She buys his favorite snack without thinking. She sends him a picture because something reminded her of him. He smiles when he receives it, maybe even genuinely. But he doesn't stop to ask himself why she's always the one remembering. He simply enjoys being remembered. There was a moment someone described to me once that has stayed in my mind. She sent him a photo of the sunset. Nothing romantic. Just, "Thought you'd like this." He looked at it, smiled, put the phone back in his pocket. Hours later she asked, "Did you see it?" He answered, "Yeah, nice." That was it. To him, it was a small interaction. To her, it had taken courage. Because after months of feeling emotionally uncertain, even sharing a sunset can feel like asking, "Do I still exist in your world?" He didn't know that. She didn't tell him. So the misunderstanding survived another day. Sometimes that's how relationships slowly disappear. Not through betrayal. Through accumulated misunderstandings nobody realizes are accumulating. He tells himself, "She knows how I feel." Does she? Or has she simply learned how to survive not knowing? There's a difference. A painful one. The strange thing is, he often isn't intentionally withholding. He's distracted, focused on work, comfortable, emotionally clumsy, maybe even overwhelmed. But comfort has a hidden side effect. When someone keeps repairing the relationship for you, you slowly stop noticing the repairs. Imagine walking through the same doorway every day. You never stop to admire the hinges. Until one morning, the door won't open. Then suddenly you notice everything. That's what happens when she stops chasing. Not because she wants to teach him a lesson. Because she simply runs out of strength. But from his perspective, it feels sudden. Almost random. He thinks, she changed. Did she? Or did the effort become visible only after it disappeared? There's an internal conversation I imagine happened. Maybe not out loud. Maybe only inside him. She's been quiet lately. So? Nothing. She's probably busy. A week passes. She still hasn't texted. She always texts. Yeah, she does. Silence. Then another thought. Should I call? You can tomorrow. Tomorrow becomes Friday. Friday becomes next week. Avoidance rarely announces itself. It procrastinates. It whispers. Later. Until later becomes regret. There's another awkward truth nobody likes admitting. Sometimes he waits for her to reach out. Not because he doesn't care, but because he's afraid she won't answer. Think about that contradiction. The man who looks emotionally distant may actually be sitting on his couch staring at her name for 10 minutes. Unlocking his phone. Locking it again. Opening a sports app. Closing it. Scrolling social media without reading anything. Clicking on her profile. Looking at the new photo. Not liking it. Because liking it suddenly feels too vulnerable. He tells himself he'll text after dinner. After dinner becomes bedtime. Bedtime becomes tomorrow. People often imagine avoidance as confidence. It usually isn't. It's hesitation stretched over time. The body says, reach for her. The mind interrupts. What if she's angry? What if she ignores you? What if you're too late? So he waits. And while he's waiting, she's quietly learning how to live without expecting him. That's the tragedy. Growth often happens in opposite directions. He's finally becoming aware of her absence. Just as she's becoming accustomed to it. Not because she wanted this. Because humans adapt. Even to heartbreak. Especially to heartbreak. The first morning she doesn't expect his message feels unbearable. The 20th morning. She makes coffee before remembering him. The 40th. She realizes she forgot to check whether he was online. She notices it almost guiltily, like she's betraying the version of herself who loved him so fiercely. But maybe she isn't betraying anything. Maybe she's just tired of living inside uncertainty. And uncertainty is exhausting in ways people underestimate. It keeps your body alert. Checking. Waiting. Listening. Interpreting. Reinterpreting. Looking for emotional weather forecasts in punctuation marks. Did he mean that period? Why did he use okay instead of okay red heart? Why did it take 4 hours this time? Eventually, the nervous system decides it can't keep living like this. Not because love disappears. Because constant anticipation becomes physically expensive. Then one ordinary afternoon, he reaches for his phone without thinking. To tell her something funny. A stupid joke from work. A dog he saw wearing sunglasses. Nothing important. He opens the conversation. And something feels different. Not because she's blocked him. Not because she's angry. Because the emotional current that always flowed toward him is no longer rushing in his direction. The conversation suddenly feels quiet. Balanced. Uncertain. For the first time. He doesn't know if she'll be there. And that's when a realization begins to arrive. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just one uncomfortable thought slipping into another. I thought she'd always be here. A long silence. Why did I think that? No answer. Only the quiet recognition. That sometimes the people who seem the most permanent were simply the ones loving you the hardest. And loving someone very hard is not the same thing as being unable to leave. The strange thing about the last time is that almost nobody realizes it's the last time while it's happening. Not her. Not him. If you had asked either of them that morning, is this the final time she'll reach for him? They probably would have laughed. Life doesn't announce endings that politely. It disguises them as ordinary Tuesdays. Maybe she sent, "How's your day going?" Maybe she asked if he got home safely. Maybe she shared a picture of something small, a crooked cloud that looked like a heart, a coffee shop they once said they'd visit together, a dog sleeping in the middle of a grocery store aisle. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that sounded like goodbye. That's what makes it so heartbreaking. The last attempt at saving something rarely looks heroic. It looks painfully ordinary. Because by then, she isn't trying to create a miracle anymore. She's just trying to see if the connection still breathes. I've noticed people imagine endings as explosions. Doors slamming. People crying. Long speeches. In reality, a lot of relationships die inside conversations about absolutely nothing. What are you doing? Working. Oh. That tiny oh. Nobody remembers saying it. But sometimes, that single word carries weeks of disappointment inside it. She wasn't upset because he was working. She was tired of feeling like every conversation arrived during a gap between other priorities. There was always another meeting. Another phone call. Another game. Another weekend with friends. Another reason. None of the reasons sounded unreasonable by themselves. That was the problem. Individually, they made sense. Together, they quietly communicated something neither of them wanted to say out loud. There never seems to be room for us. He probably would have disagreed. I make time. And maybe he believed that. Memory is funny. We remember intentions more clearly than patterns. She remembered the waiting. He remembered the moments he eventually showed up. Both memories were real. They just belonged to different emotional worlds. There's one scene I can't stop thinking about. A woman sitting in her parked car outside her apartment building. The engine already off. Rain tapping softly against the windshield. She wasn't crying. Not yet. She was reading one conversation over and over. Nothing terrible had happened. Actually, if someone else looked at those messages, they might think everything seemed normal. That's the strange thing about emotional neglect. Most screenshots don't capture it. It's hidden in timing, in frequency, in effort, in what keeps not happening. She scrolled upward. Weeks of conversations. Almost every thread started with her. Good morning. How'd your interview go? Drive safe. Did you eat? Hope your meeting went well. Look what I found. Thinking of you. Then his replies. Sometimes warm. Sometimes affectionate. Sometimes funny. But almost always. Responses. Rarely beginnings. She stared at the screen longer than she wanted to admit. Not because she was counting. Because suddenly she couldn't stop seeing something she hadn't wanted to notice before. Love had quietly become one-sided in its momentum. Not necessarily in feeling. In movement. There's a difference. Someone can love you and still stop moving toward you. Someone can miss you and still wait for you to close every distance. That contradiction is painfully human. I don't think he woke up deciding, I'm going to let her carry this relationship. I think he simply adapted. Humans adapt to almost everything, including being emotionally pursued, especially when the pursuit feels unconditional. There's an uncomfortable conversation I imagine happening inside his own head. She knows I love her. Does she? I mean, yeah. How? Silence. Because she has to know. But when was the last time you made sure? No answer. Just the television still playing in the background while his thoughts drift somewhere he doesn't want them to go. Meanwhile, she's having an entirely different conversation inside herself. Maybe I'm asking for too much. Are you? I don't know anymore. What are you actually asking for? A long pause. For him to meet me halfway. Another silence. Is that halfway? She doesn't answer. Because suddenly, she isn't sure. When you've spent months adjusting your expectations downward, your emotional measuring tape becomes unreliable. You start wondering if basic reciprocity is asking for luxury. That's what prolonged uncertainty does. It confuses your sense of normal. I remember hearing someone describe this feeling in a way I never forgot. She said, I realized I was celebrating things that should have been ordinary. A phone call. A planned date. A thoughtful question. She celebrated them because they had become rare. Read that again. When ordinary care starts feeling extraordinary, something has already shifted. And maybe that's what made the last message different. Not the words. The expectation behind them. Or rather, the absence of expectation. She still hoped. But hope had become quieter. Less demanding. Less convincing. She sent the message. Then put the phone down. Not to play a game. Because she suddenly felt too tired to stare at it. That's new. Months ago she would have watched the screen. Every notification making her heart jump. Every vibration sending adrenaline through her chest. Now, she folded laundry. Watered the plants. Listened to half a podcast without absorbing a single sentence. She still thought about him. Just. Less urgently. It's amazing how emotional exhaustion changes the body before it changes the mind. Your shoulders relax before your heart does. Your breathing slows before your attachment catches up. Your thumb stops refreshing the conversation before you consciously decide to let go. People think letting go is a decision. Sometimes. It's simply fatigue. He replied hours later. Maybe longer. His response wasn't rude. That's important. Because if he'd been cruel, leaving would have been easier. Instead it was something ordinary. Sorry, just saw this. Then a short answer. Maybe even a smiley face. Enough kindness to prevent certainty. Not enough presence to create safety. That's one of the hardest emotional spaces to live inside. Not abandoned. Not chosen. Just. Perpetually waiting. She looked at his message. Read it. Started typing. Stopped. Started again. Deleted everything. Then she wrote. No worries. 3 words. People underestimate those 3 words. No worries. Sometimes they genuinely mean forgiveness. Sometimes they're surrender wearing good manners. She wasn't saying, it's okay. She was saying, I don't have the energy to explain why it isn't. There's a sadness in reaching that point. Not dramatic sadness. The quieter kind. The kind where your body no longer believes difficult conversations will change anything. So instead, you protect what's left of your dignity by saying less. She closed the conversation, walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, forgot what she wanted, closed it again, stood there staring at nothing. Have you ever noticed how grief makes ordinary tasks feel strangely incomplete? You open cabinets without purpose, walk into rooms and forget why. Pour coffee that goes cold untouched. Your mind keeps leaving the present because it's replaying something that never fully happened. She wasn't mourning the end. Not yet. She was mourning the version of the relationship she kept hoping would finally begin. There's a difference. One evening, a friend asked her, how are things with him? She smiled automatically. They're fine. The conversation moved on. Later that night, she thought about why she'd lied. Not because she wanted to protect him. Because saying, I think I'm slowly disappearing inside this relationship, and I don't know if he notices, felt impossible. People don't usually confess the slow heartbreaks. They confess the dramatic ones. The slow ones feel too embarrassing. Too difficult to explain. How do you tell someone? He isn't treating me terribly. He just keeps making me feel optional. Optional. Maybe that's the word. Not unloved. Not rejected. Just emotionally scheduled around. And eventually something inside her asked a question she had been avoiding for months. Not, does he love me? A different question. Can this version of love actually sustain me? The answer didn't arrive like lightning. It arrived like a sigh. Long. Quiet. Almost reluctant. I don't think so. She cried after that. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough for tears to collect on the sleeves of the sweatshirt she'd been wearing all evening. Then she washed her face. Brushed her teeth. Set an alarm for work. Life kept moving. That's another thing nobody tells you. Some of the biggest emotional decisions happen right before completely ordinary Wednesdays. He probably went to bed thinking everything was okay. She went to bed realizing she couldn't keep asking reality to become something it had refused to become for months. Neither of them knew that the next morning something invisible would be different. She would still answer if he texted. She would still care. She would still miss him. But deep inside, the part of her that kept believing one more conversation would finally change everything, had quietly laid itself down to rest. Not because she stopped loving him, because she finally stopped arguing with what his consistent behavior had been trying to tell her all along. And perhaps that's the cruelest part. The last time she reached out didn't feel like an ending. It felt like one more ordinary attempt. She simply didn't know that somewhere between pressing send and accepting another emotionally incomplete reply, she had unknowingly sent the final message from the version of herself who still believed love could survive on hope alone. When people say they need space, they're usually imagining a very specific kind of silence. A temporary one. A peaceful one. The kind where everything pauses without changing. Where emotions politely wait in the corner until they're ready to deal with them. Where the other person stays exactly where they left them. Still loving. Still available. Still hoping. Still there. That's the fantasy. Reality is quieter than that. And much less forgiving. The first day she doesn't text. He barely notices. He's busy. Work runs late. His phone buzzes with emails. Friends send memes. Life continues exactly as it did the day before. Maybe, somewhere in the back of his mind, he thinks, she must be busy too. Or maybe he doesn't think about it at all. Not because he doesn't care. Because human attention naturally flows toward whatever feels most urgent. And at that moment, her silence doesn't feel urgent. It feels temporary. There's a dangerous comfort in believing someone will always come back. Comfort makes us bad at noticing change. Think about the sound of your refrigerator. You probably don't hear it right now. Not because it stopped humming. Because your brain decided it wasn't important. Presence works the same way. The people who remain consistent slowly become part of the background of our emotional lives. Not less valuable. Just less consciously noticed. Until one day, the sound disappears. Then suddenly, the silence becomes deafening. The second day feels different. Not dramatic. Just slightly unusual. He unlocks his phone during lunch. No good morning. No random photo. No funny observation about the cashier who accidentally gave her 2 receipts. Nothing. He stares for maybe 3 seconds. Then puts the phone back into his pocket. She'll probably text later. The thought passes as quickly as it arrives. Later comes. Nothing. The third day. He almost messages her. Almost. He opens the conversation. His thumb hovers over the keyboard. Hey. Too simple. Delete. How have you been? Too formal. Delete. Sorry, I've been busy. Busy with what? Delete. He locks the screen. Not because he decides not to reach out. Because suddenly reaching out feels strangely complicated. Avoidance has a way of making simple things feel emotionally expensive. 3 days ago, sending her a message would have taken 10 seconds. Now, it feels like opening a conversation he's not sure how to have. So instead, he waits another day. Human beings are experts at mistaking delay for strategy. Meanwhile, her silence isn't strategic at all. She's sitting on the floor of her apartment folding towels fresh from the dryer. The room smells faintly of laundry detergent and warm cotton. A podcast is playing in the background. She isn't really listening. Every few minutes, her eyes drift toward the coffee table. Her phone is lying there. Face up. Screen dark. She notices herself looking. Then quietly laughs. Not because anything is funny. Because she's realizing how automatic the habit has become. It's almost physical. Like reaching for a seatbelt. Or checking your pockets before leaving the house. For months, her nervous system had been trained to anticipate him. Now, it's slowly being retrained by reality. Nobody tells you this part. Healing often begins as muscle memory arguing with truth. Your body reaches. Reality doesn't. Eventually, your body learns. Not because it wants to. Because repetition teaches what hope cannot. Back on his side. Something small happens. He's driving home from work. A song comes on. One she used to sing terribly off-key. He laughs without thinking. Instinctively. He reaches for his phone at a red light. To send. This song just came on. Then he stops. Something feels unfamiliar. He realizes he doesn't know whether she still wants to hear from him. That uncertainty surprises him. Not because she ever said she didn't. Because for the first time, he has to consider that access isn't automatic. The light turns green. The moment passes. He keeps driving. Funny how life gives us tiny windows to reconnect. And how often fear convinces us they'll still be there tomorrow. Tomorrow. He notices something else. Her social media is quiet. Or maybe it isn't. Maybe she posted. He simply wasn't the first person she shared it with anymore. He clicks on her profile. A picture. Nothing extraordinary. Coffee. A book. Sunlight on a wooden table. Someone comments. Looks peaceful. She replies with a smile. He stares at that smile longer than he'd like to admit. Not because she's smiling. Because she smiled. Without him. It's such an irrational feeling. Almost childish. He doesn't think she belongs to him. He knows she has every right to enjoy her day. Yet something inside him whispers. I thought I was still part of that world. That thought unsettles him. Not enough to call. Not yet. Just enough to stay with him during dinner. It's fascinating how regret rarely enters through the front door. It sneaks in through ordinary moments. The empty passenger seat. A restaurant you used to visit together. The grocery store where you instinctively reach for their favorite snack before remembering they're no longer coming over. Loss is deeply practical. It hides inside routines. She experiences it differently. She reaches the grocery store. Walks past his favorite cereal. Stops. Looks at it for 2 seconds. Then keeps walking. Months ago, she would have bought it. Just in case he visited. Now, she doesn't. Not out of anger. Because she's finally shopping for the life she's actually living. Not the one she's still imagining. That sounds like such a small thing. A box of cereal. But healing rarely announces itself with fireworks. Sometimes, it quietly changes your shopping list. One evening, he finally sends a message. Hey, how's everything? Simple. Casual. Safe. He reads it twice before pressing send. The little delivered appears. Then nothing. 5 minutes. 10. 30. An hour. He tells himself. She's probably busy. The irony doesn't occur to him immediately. How many times had she told herself the exact same thing? How many evenings had she protected him with explanations he never asked for? He's probably in a meeting. His phone probably died. He's probably just exhausted. Hope always sounds reasonable while you're inside it. Now, he's borrowing the same language she once used to survive him. His body reacts before his mind does. He checks the conversation again. Still nothing. A tiny knot forms in his stomach. Not panic. Just discomfort. He isn't used to waiting. Because she never made him wait before. Hours later. She replies. I've been okay. Hope you're doing well too. That's it. No question. No continuation. No emotional bridge waiting for him to cross. He reads it several times. Something about it feels polite. Gentle. Kind. And impossibly far away. He can't explain why. The words aren't cold. Actually, that's what bothers him. If she'd been angry, he would have known what to do. Anger invites repair. Distance doesn't. Distance leaves you talking to memories instead of emotions. There's an internal dialogue happening inside him now. She's different. Is she? She used to tell me everything. When was the last time you asked enough questions to hear everything? Silence. She used to need me. Or maybe she stopped asking you to be there. Another silence. Those are uncomfortable conversations. The kind nobody wants to have with themselves. Especially when there's no one left to blame. Meanwhile, she isn't trying to become mysterious. She's learning something she never wanted to learn. How to carry joy without immediately turning toward him. She sees a beautiful sunset. She takes a picture. For a split second. Her thumb automatically searches for his name. Then stops. She smiles to herself. Not sadly. Just. Knowingly. The picture stays in her camera roll. Not everything beautiful has to be shared with the person who once meant everything. That's a painful milestone. And also, a peaceful one. The silence between them keeps growing. But something unexpected begins to happen. He starts hearing her everywhere. Not literally. Emotionally. The way she used to laugh at his terrible jokes. The way she'd notice tiny details no one else mentioned. The way she'd ask, "Did you eat today?" He suddenly realizes. No one asks him that anymore. Not because no one cares. Because everyone loves differently. He had become so accustomed to her way of loving that he never imagined what life would feel like without it. He thought he needed less from the relationship than she did. Maybe he even believed she was the emotional one. The needy one. The one who asked for reassurance. But now, his own days begin to feel strangely empty. Not because his schedule changes. His schedule is exactly the same. Work. Gym. Dinner. Television. Sleep. Everything is still there. Everything except the invisible thread that used to run through all of it. The small messages. The check-ins. The quiet certainty that somewhere, someone was thinking about him without being reminded. That's what disappears first. Not love. Being emotionally remembered. And human beings underestimate how much they depend on that. Weeks later, he walks into his apartment, drops his keys into the same bowl by the door, takes off his shoes. The room is exactly as it always was. Same couch, same lamp, same silence. Only now, the silence feels different. Not peaceful. Heavy. Almost observant. As if the room itself is asking a question he has spent months avoiding. Is this the space you wanted? He sits down, leans his head back, closes his eyes. Inside his mind, two voices quietly begin arguing. You wanted space. I know. Then why does everything feel so empty? A long pause. Because I thought space meant she'd still be waiting on the other side of it. No answer comes. Only the sound of the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. The ticking clock on the wall. A passing car outside. And for the first time, he begins to understand something he had never truly considered. The silence he asked for was never supposed to become her new language. He imagined a pause. She had quietly begun building a life beyond it. And while he was waiting for things to stay the same, she was slowly learning how to breathe. Without waiting for the next message to tell her she still mattered. People love dramatic stories. The moment she leaves. The speech she gives. The door she closes. The text she never answers. Those moments make good movies. But real healing rarely begins with courage. It begins with exhaustion. The morning after she finally stopped chasing didn't feel empowering. It felt strangely empty. She woke up before her alarm, reached for her phone almost automatically. The movement happened before she was fully awake. Her fingers found the screen, unlocked it. No messages. For a split second, her heart reacted exactly the way it always had. A tiny drop in her stomach. A familiar ache behind her ribs. Then something different happened. She didn't send anything. Not because she had made a promise to herself. Because she genuinely didn't know what else she could possibly say. It's amazing how quiet a person becomes after they've said the same thing 100 different ways. She had already explained that she felt lonely. She had already explained that consistency mattered. She had already explained that she wasn't asking for perfection. She had already explained that she missed him while he was still technically there. How many languages can one heart translate itself into? Eventually, silence becomes the last language left. She placed the phone back on the nightstand, rolled onto her back, stared at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above her. For months, every morning had begun with one invisible question. Will today be different? That morning, for the first time, She didn't ask it. Not because she'd stopped caring. Because she'd stopped negotiating with reality before she'd even gotten out of bed. There is a strange kind of peace hidden inside acceptance. Not happiness. Not relief. Just less resistance. She made coffee. The same coffee she'd been making for years. Only this time, she noticed its smell. That sounds insignificant. But grief steals attention. When you're constantly waiting for someone, your senses become trapped inside anticipation. You drink coffee without tasting it. You drive home without remembering the road. You watch movies while checking your phone every 6 minutes. Waiting occupies space. Far more space than most people realize. Now, there was still sadness. But there was also room. Room to hear birds outside the kitchen window. Room to notice the sunlight stretching across the counter. Room to realize she'd been buying flowers less and less because she'd stopped believing beauty changed how empty the apartment felt. On the way home from work that afternoon, she pulled into a bookstore. Not because she planned to. Because she saw it while waiting at a traffic light. Months earlier, she probably would have driven past. She would have wanted to get home. Just in case he called. Now, there was nowhere she needed to rush back to. She wandered between shelves without looking for anything specific. A travel book. A cookbook. A novel she'd heard about months ago. She picked it up. Read the first page. Bought it. The cashier smiled. Good choice. She smiled back. Walking to her car, she suddenly realized something. Nobody had interrupted this afternoon. Nobody had canceled. Nobody had left her wondering what time they might show up. The afternoon simply belonged to her. It had been a long time since she'd experienced that. Not because he controlled her. He didn't. She had quietly surrendered her own attention. There's an important difference. Love doesn't always ask us to sacrifice ourselves. Sometimes, we volunteer. Without noticing. Little by little. We stop choosing restaurants we like because they don't. We stop watching movies we're excited about because they aren't interested. We postpone vacations. Postpone hobbies. Postpone ourselves. Always temporarily. Until temporary quietly becomes years. She wasn't angry about that realization. Mostly, she felt surprised. When did I stop asking myself what I wanted? The question lingered longer than she expected. Later that week, a co-worker invited her to dinner. Months ago, she would have hesitated. Maybe another time. I might already have plans. Plans that usually meant waiting to see if he became available. This time, she heard herself say, "Yeah, I'd love to." The words came out before she had time to overthink them. At dinner, someone told a ridiculous story about accidentally sending a voice message while arguing with their GPS. Everyone laughed. She laughed too. Really laughed. The kind where your shoulders shake and you have to wipe tears from the corners of your eyes. Halfway through, the laughter stopped her. Not externally. Internally. A quiet realization drifted across her mind. I forgot about him for almost 20 minutes. Then guilt arrived. Immediately. Unexpectedly. Because healing often feels like betrayal before it feels like freedom. She stared into her glass of water. Part of her whispered, "If you can laugh this hard, did you ever really love him?" Another part answered almost immediately. "No. It means your heart remembered how to breathe." That answer stayed with her all week. People assume moving forward means loving someone less. Sometimes, it simply means loving your own life enough to participate in it again. The changes remained almost invisible. She started cooking meals instead of eating cereal over the sink. She replaced the dying plant she'd forgotten to water. She opened windows in the morning. Played music while cleaning. None of these things erased her sadness. but sadness slowly stopped being the only resident in the room. One Saturday, she found herself dancing for maybe 15 seconds while folding laundry. Not real dancing. Just that awkward little movement people make when they think no one's watching. She froze, almost embarrassed, then laughed. There it was again. Life, quietly returning without asking permission. The strange thing is, she still missed him. Every day. Healing isn't the opposite of missing someone. Those two emotions often live together. She could be perfectly content buying groceries, and suddenly remember the way he'd always grabbed the ripest avocados. She could enjoy a sunny afternoon, and still wonder whether he'd remembered to wear sunscreen. Love doesn't disappear because you stop chasing. It simply stops driving the entire car. There were difficult days too. Nobody talks enough about those. One night, she dreamed he had called. She woke up smiling, reached for the phone. Nothing. The disappointment hit her before she was fully conscious. She cried that morning, made breakfast anyway, went to work anyway, answered emails, smiled politely during meetings. Healing isn't linear. It's repetitive. Some days your nervous system believes you've accepted everything. The next morning, it behaves as though the heartbreak happened yesterday. That's normal. Our bodies grieve at different speeds than our thoughts. One evening, she opened an old photo album on her phone. Vacation pictures. Screenshots of silly conversations. Videos where neither of them realized they were being recorded. She watched one clip 3 times. He was trying to cook pancakes, burning every single one, laughing so hard he could barely breathe. She smiled. Then she cried. Not because she wanted him back in that moment. Because grief isn't only missing who someone became. Sometimes, it's missing the version of both of you that no longer exists. She closed the album. Not dramatically. Just gently. Like closing the cover of a book she'd finally finished rereading. Days turned into weeks. Without planning it, her routines changed. She no longer checked whether he was online before going to sleep. She stopped calculating time differences. Stopped wondering whether a delayed reply meant something. Stopped rehearsing difficult conversations while showering. The amount of mental space this freed surprised her. She hadn't realized how exhausting constant interpretation had become. Imagine carrying a backpack every single day. After a while, you stop noticing its weight. Then one morning, you accidentally leave it at home. You don't immediately feel lighter. You simply wonder why walking seems easier. That's what emotional freedom often feels like. Not excitement. Reduced effort. One afternoon, she caught her reflection in the window of a coffee shop. There was nothing dramatically different about her. Same eyes. Same hair. Same jacket she'd owned for years. But something in her posture had changed. Her shoulders weren't leaning toward expectation anymore. She looked present. Not healed. Present. That distinction matters. Healing suggests completion. Presence simply means you're no longer living entirely somewhere else. She remembered something she'd once said during one of their hardest conversations. I just want us to choose each other. At the time, she believed the sentence was about him. Now, standing there with a warm coffee in her hand, she realized she'd forgotten someone. Herself. For months, she had been asking him to choose the relationship, while quietly abandoning her own relationship with herself. She wasn't blaming herself. She understood why it happened. Love can make us generous. Fear can make us disappear. The goal isn't to become less loving. It's to stop making yourself the price of someone else's comfort. Weeks later, her phone buzzed while she was reading in bed. She glanced at the screen. His name. Her heartbeat quickened. Of course it did. Some attachments don't dissolve because a calendar page turns. She looked at the message. Didn't open it immediately. Not to punish him. Because she was in the middle of a chapter. She placed the phone face down beside her. Finished the page she was reading. Then another. Only afterward. She picked it up again. As she reached for the screen, she stopped. Not because she didn't care. Because she suddenly understood something that would have been impossible for her to understand months earlier. The woman reaching for this phone was not the same woman who had once waited beside it. She still carried love. She still carried memories. She still carried tenderness. But she no longer carried the desperate belief that another person's attention determined whether her day could begin. And perhaps that was the quiet transformation nobody else could see. She hadn't become harder. She hadn't become colder. She hadn't become impossible to love. She had simply remembered something heartbreak has a strange way of teaching. That returning to yourself isn't one grand decision. It's hundreds of ordinary moments where, little by little, you stop organizing your entire life around someone else's uncertainty and begin building one around your own quiet, steady presence. Because in the end, the woman who stops chasing doesn't magically become fearless. She still flinches at familiar names. She still misses certain songs. She still pauses when she passes places they once loved. But now, when she walks away from those memories, she doesn't leave herself behind with them. She finally walks forward, with both hands wrapped gently around the one person who had been waiting for her return all along. Herself. If you've ever imagined regret, you probably imagined it arriving like lightning. A sudden realization. A desperate phone call. A person running through the rain saying, "I made the biggest mistake of my life." Movies love that version. Real life is quieter. Regret usually doesn't knock on the front door. It slips through the smallest cracks. One ordinary morning. One familiar song. One empty seat. One habit that suddenly has nowhere to go. That's how it began for him. Not with heartbreak. With absence. The apartment hadn't changed. His routine hadn't changed. His job hadn't changed. Even the weather seemed exactly the same. And yet, something invisible had gone missing. At first, he couldn't name it. He simply noticed that the days felt strangely unfinished. He would leave work, drive home, unlock the door, throw his keys into the bowl by the entrance, take off his shoes, then pause, as if he'd forgotten to do something. Except there wasn't anything left to do. For months, someone had quietly lived inside the rhythm of his day. Not physically, emotionally. She had been the text asking if traffic was bad, the picture of the sunset she thought he'd like, the reminder to drink water, the random article she'd found because it mentioned one of his hobbies. None of those moments felt important when they were happening. That's the strange thing about consistency. You rarely appreciate the things that happen every day. You only notice the silence after they stop. There's a psychological phenomenon people don't talk about enough. Our brains are excellent at adapting to comfort. The first time someone cares deeply for you, it feels extraordinary. By the 100th time, it feels normal. Not because you love them less. Because your nervous system quietly files their presence under expected. Expected things become invisible. Until expectation disappears. Then suddenly, everything feels different. One Friday evening, his co-workers decided to grab dinner after work. He almost said no. Then changed his mind. Maybe getting out would help. The restaurant was crowded. Music played softly overhead. People laughed at neighboring tables. Someone ordered too much food. Someone else spilled a drink. The kind of ordinary evening he'd enjoyed 100 times before. Halfway through dinner, his friend picked up his phone. "My girlfriend keeps asking if I've eaten." Everyone laughed. Another friend rolled his eyes. "Mine too." More laughter. Without thinking, he reached into his own pocket. His fingers wrapped around his phone. There was nothing there. No message. No check-in. No tiny reminder that someone had been thinking about him in the middle of their own day. For a brief moment, the conversation around him faded into the background. He wasn't jealous. He wasn't angry. He simply remembered. She used to do that. Every Friday. Without fail. Drive safe after dinner. 3 seconds. Maybe 5. That's all those messages ever took. He had answered them so casually. Will do. Or, thanks. Sometimes only with a thumbs-up emoji. At the time, they seemed almost forgettable. Now, he would have given anything to receive one again. Funny how memory edits itself. It rarely replays the dramatic arguments first. It replays the ordinary kindness, the tiny rituals, the things you never imagined could disappear. On the drive home, he caught himself opening their old conversation. Not to text her. Just to scroll. He kept moving upward through months of messages. Birthdays. Inside jokes. Photos of bad coffee. Voice notes. Arguments. Apologies. Plans that never happened. The timeline looked like a relationship. But something else caught his attention. Not the words. The pattern. She had always reached first. He had never consciously noticed it. Because while you are living inside a pattern, it simply feels like reality. Only distance turns patterns into evidence. He kept scrolling. Good morning. Hope your meeting goes well. Did you get home okay? I'm proud of you. How's your mom? Don't forget your appointment. Little pieces of care. Stitched into ordinary life. He whispered something almost without realizing it. I thought she just liked texting. The sentence hung in the empty apartment. Then another thought answered it. Maybe that was how she loved. That realization landed somewhere much deeper than guilt. It touched grief. Because suddenly, he wasn't remembering messages. He was remembering effort. Effort he had mistaken for personality. Effort he had assumed would always exist. People often confuse someone's way of loving with who they are. She's just affectionate. She's naturally patient. She enjoys taking care of people. Maybe. Or maybe. Those things required energy. Energy she chose to spend on him. Energy that slowly ran out. One afternoon, he passed a flower stand outside a grocery store. Fresh sunflowers. White lilies. Small bundles of lavender. Without thinking, he almost bought her favorite flowers. His hand actually reached toward them. Then stopped. There was nowhere to take them. He smiled sadly at himself. The florist noticed. Special occasion? He hesitated. No. Then after a pause. Not anymore. The words surprised even him. Sometimes, our mouths tell the truth before our minds catch up. That evening, he found an old hoodie she'd left behind months earlier. He had meant to return it. Then forgot. It still carried the faintest trace of her perfume. Not enough to recognize immediately. Just enough to awaken memory. Smell is strange like that. It bypasses logic. One breath. And suddenly you're standing in a completely different year. He sat on the edge of the bed holding that hoodie longer than he'd admit to anyone. Not because he wanted the object. Because objects quietly become witnesses. That sweatshirt had watched movie nights. Long conversations. Comfort after difficult days. Arguments that ended in apologies. Now, it was simply fabric. And yet, it somehow carried the weight of an entire season of his life. Across town, she wasn't thinking about him every minute anymore. That surprised her too. There were still moments. Of course there were. But now, they arrived like weather. They passed through instead of becoming the climate. One Sunday morning, she was watering plants on her balcony. A breeze moved through the leaves. The city sounded peaceful below. She suddenly realized she hadn't checked whether he'd viewed her stories in weeks. Months ago, that would have been impossible. Not because she was obsessive, because she was searching for reassurance wherever she could find it. Now, she genuinely forgot. That frightened her for half a second, then comforted her. Healing often feels unfamiliar because pain had become familiar. Back in his apartment, the nights became longer. Not because he couldn't sleep, because silence had started asking questions. When did she stop smiling the way she used to? How many times did she tell me she felt alone? Why did I always think there would be another chance to fix it? Questions are strange companions. They become louder after midnight, especially the ones without answers. He replayed old conversations differently now. Not changing the facts, changing the perspective. He remembered one evening when she'd said quietly, "I don't need you to solve everything. I just need you to show up." At the time, he had heard criticism. Now, he heard exhaustion. Same sentence. Different ears. Distance changes interpretation. It's one of heartbreak's cruelest abilities. There is something psychologists sometimes describe as delayed emotional processing. The mind often protects itself in the moment. Only later, when the danger has passed, does it allow the full weight of reality to arrive. Relationships can work the same way. While she was still there, he could postpone difficult conversations. Assume tomorrow would exist. Believe consistency didn't need immediate attention. Once she was gone, his mind finally had enough quiet to process everything it had postponed. Regret wasn't attacking him. Memory was. And memory, without distraction, is remarkably honest. One afternoon, his phone suggested an old photograph. On this day 2 years ago, there they were, standing on a beach, wind pushing her hair across her face. He's laughing because she had just thrown sand at him. Neither of them looking at the camera. Completely unaware they were creating something they'd later mourn. He stared at that picture for a long time. Not because they looked happy. Because she looked safe. She leaned against him without hesitation. The kind of trust that takes years to build. He whispered, "When did I stop protecting that?" No answer came. Only another uncomfortable realization. Nothing catastrophic had destroyed them. There hadn't been betrayal. There hadn't been cruelty. There had simply been neglect. Small. Repeated. Almost invisible. The kind that's difficult to notice while it's happening. Like watching a shoreline disappear one wave at a time. You don't see the difference after one wave. Only after an entire season. Weeks later, he finally understood something that had once seemed impossible. She hadn't left because she stopped loving him. She left because she had been loving both of them for too long. That realization broke something open inside him. Not pride. Illusion. The illusion that love survives simply because it exists. Love isn't only a feeling. It's maintenance. Attention. Curiosity. Presence. The willingness to notice someone before they have to ask to be noticed. He had confused stability with permanence. She had mistaken patience for possibility. Both of them had been wrong. Just in different ways. Meanwhile, her own life continued expanding. She laughed more easily now. Her apartment felt warmer. Friends noticed something different about her. Not louder. Not more confident. Just lighter. One friend said, "You seem peaceful." She smiled. "I think I'm finally getting there." The answer surprised her. Because peace hadn't arrived all at once either. It had come in pieces. One uninterrupted morning. One evening without checking her phone. One conversation where she didn't mention him. One weekend she genuinely enjoyed. Healing and regret follow surprisingly similar paths. Neither arrives dramatically. Both are built from hundreds of tiny moments that slowly change who you become. Months after everything ended, he drove past the coffee shop where they used to spend Saturday mornings. He almost kept driving, then turned into the parking lot. He ordered the drink she always recommended, sat by the window, watched strangers walk past. For the first time, he allowed himself to stop asking, "How do I get her back?" Instead, a quieter question appeared. Why did it take losing her for me to understand how she had been loving me? That question hurt, because some answers arrived too late to repair the past, but not too late to transform the person carrying them. And perhaps that's the saddest truth about regret. It rarely appears while there's still time to prevent the loss. It waits patiently until the house is quiet, until the routines have changed, until the good morning texts have become memories, until the person who once begged to be noticed has finally learned how to live without waiting. By then, regret is no longer asking for another chance. It is simply sitting beside you, teaching you the value of what you didn't fully see, while it was still choosing you every single day. There comes a moment in some endings when love is no longer the biggest obstacle. Pride is. Not the loud kind. Not arrogance. A quieter kind. The kind that whispers, "What if she rejects me? What if she's happier without me? What if I admit I was wrong?" And it's too late. By the time he realized he wanted her back, he wasn't only fighting the distance between them. He was fighting the version of himself that had created it. And that is a much harder conversation to begin. Because saying, "I miss you," is vulnerable. But saying, "I finally understand how much I hurt you," requires something much deeper. It requires the death of the story you've been telling yourself. For weeks, he had replayed everything in his head. The arguments, the silences, the missed opportunities, the unanswered messages. At first, he still found ways to soften his responsibility. "I was under a lot of pressure. Work was overwhelming. She expected too much sometimes." Those explanations weren't completely false. Life really had been stressful. Work really had demanded more than usual. Relationships really are complicated. But something inside him had started asking a different question. Even if all of that was true, did it excuse making someone feel alone? He didn't have an answer. Because deep down, he already knew it didn't. One evening, he opened the Notes app on his phone. He stared at the blinking cursor. Started typing. "I've been thinking about everything." Delete. "I miss you." Delete. "Can we talk?" Delete. Nothing felt honest enough. Or maybe everything felt too honest. He realized he wasn't struggling to find the right words. He was struggling to become the person who deserved to say them. That distinction mattered. For months, he had believed the hardest thing was admitting he wanted her back. Now he understood. Wanting someone back is easy. Becoming accountable is difficult. Accountability has no shortcuts. It forces you to look directly at the places where your intentions and your actions stopped matching. A few days later, he met an old friend for coffee. They hadn't seen each other in months. After catching up, his friend asked casually, "So, how are things with you two?" He hesitated. "We're not together anymore." The friend nodded quietly. What happened? Such a simple question. Yet suddenly, he realized he didn't know how to answer it. Months earlier, he probably would have said, "We just grew apart." Or, "We wanted different things." Those explanations sounded balanced. Safe. They protected everyone, including himself. But now, those answers felt incomplete. He looked down at his coffee. then said something he'd never admitted out loud. I think. I kept expecting her to understand me, without putting the same effort into understanding her. The words sat between them. His friend didn't interrupt, didn't rush to comfort him. Sometimes, silence is kinder than reassurance. After a while, his friend asked softly, "Do you think she knows you see that now?" He looked away. No. Why not? Because that question carried another one beneath it. If you know now, why haven't you told her? The answer wasn't simple. It wasn't because he didn't care. It wasn't because he didn't want another chance. It was because regret often arrives carrying shame. And shame is strangely paralyzing. People think shame sounds like self-hatred. Often, it sounds like hesitation. Maybe I shouldn't bother her. She probably doesn't want to hear from me. I'll just make things worse. Those thoughts can sound respectful. Sometimes they are. Sometimes, they're fear wearing respectful clothes. Across town, she was building a life that no longer revolved around wondering whether he would return. Not because she had stopped loving him, because she had stopped placing her future inside someone else's uncertainty. There is a difference. One Saturday afternoon, she met her sister for lunch. Halfway through the meal, her sister smiled. "You laugh differently now." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "I don't know." Her sister shrugged. "It sounds lighter." She laughed again. "This one?" "Yeah, that one." She thought about it all afternoon. Could laughter really change? Maybe it could. Pain changes the way we breathe. Why wouldn't healing change the way we laugh? Later that evening, she walked home carrying leftovers. The sunset painted the buildings in warm orange light. She caught herself smiling at absolutely nothing. No reason. No message. No achievement. Just existing. Months ago, that would have felt impossible. Back then, every good moment had immediately looked for someone to share it with. Now, the moment belonged entirely to her. Meanwhile, he found himself becoming increasingly aware of tiny reminders. Not dramatic ones. Tiny ones. The coffee mug she'd bought him. The playlist she'd created during a road trip. The recipe she'd insisted he learn because, "One day you'll thank me." He cooked it one evening. Burned half of it. Laughed quietly. Then unexpectedly, started crying. Not because of the food. Because memory had stopped feeling like nostalgia. It had started feeling like accountability. There is an uncomfortable stage of regret where you stop asking, "Why did this happen?" and begin asking, "What part of this belonged to me?" That question changes everything. Because once you genuinely answer it, you can never return to the old version of the story. Weeks passed. The message remained unwritten. Not because he had forgotten. Because every day that passed seemed to increase the weight of reaching out. Funny how avoidance works. Today feels awkward. Tomorrow feels impossible. Time doesn't always heal unfinished conversations. Sometimes, it makes them heavier. One night, he found himself reading old journal entries. He rarely wrote, only during stressful periods. One sentence caught his attention. "She always believes in me, even when I don't deserve it." He stopped reading. The date was almost 2 years old. Back then, he had known exactly how much she gave. So what happened? The answer came slowly. Nothing happened. That's the problem. He simply stopped noticing. Human beings don't always lose appreciation because love fades. Sometimes, routine quietly covers gratitude like dust settling over furniture. Not overnight. One ordinary day after another. Until eventually, something precious begins to look ordinary. She had become ordinary to him. Not because she was. Because she had remained consistent for so long. Consistency is one of the least celebrated forms of love. It isn't exciting. It doesn't demand attention. It simply keeps showing up. Until one day, it doesn't. Then suddenly, it becomes the only thing you can think about. One afternoon, he finally typed a message. Not perfect. Just honest. I've been thinking about us a lot. Not because I'm lonely. Because I finally understand some things I didn't understand before. You tried to tell me for a long time that you felt alone. I heard your words. I just didn't understand their weight. I'm sorry. He stared at it for several minutes. Read it again. Then locked the phone. He didn't send it. Not yet. People often assume hesitation means manipulation. Sometimes. Hesitation comes from recognizing that apologies are no longer about relieving your own guilt. He asked himself a difficult question. Am I apologizing because she deserves to hear it, or because I need forgiveness? Those are not the same thing. Real accountability asks for nothing in return. Not reconciliation. Not another chance. Not reassurance. Only the opportunity to tell the truth. Meanwhile, she had no idea he was sitting alone asking these questions. She wasn't waiting. She wasn't checking her phone every 5 minutes anymore. In fact, there were entire afternoons when she forgot where she'd left it. She had started taking weekend photography walks. Nothing professional. Just wandering through neighborhoods she hadn't explored before. Old bookstores. Street musicians. Children chasing pigeons across public squares. She discovered that paying attention to the world left less room for obsessively monitoring one person's attention. That realization felt almost miraculous. Months earlier, her emotional world had narrowed until it revolved around one conversation. Now, life had quietly become wide again. The irony is, this was the version of her he probably would have fallen in love with all over again. Not because she had changed into someone new. Because she had returned to the person she had been before fear taught her to shrink. One rainy evening, their paths almost crossed. He walked into the grocery store. She walked out. Different entrances. Different timing. Only a minute apart. Neither of them knew. Life is full of invisible intersections like that. Moments where two people come unbelievably close, while living completely separate realities. A week later, he finally pressed send. No dramatic speech. No promises. No pressure. Just honesty. Then, he put the phone down. Didn't pace. Didn't stare at the screen. Didn't calculate how long she'd taken to respond. Because somewhere along the way, he had learned something from losing her. Love cannot demand vulnerability from someone else, while refusing it yourself. Hours passed. Then evening. Then night. No reply. He felt disappointment. Of course he did. But beneath the disappointment, there was something unexpected. Acceptance. For the first time, he understood that she no longer owed him immediate emotional access simply because he had finally become ready. That realization hurt. But it was fair. Because healing changes both people. Not only the one who leaves. Days later, her phone buzzed while she was reorganizing a bookshelf. She saw his name. She sat down. Read every word slowly. Not because she was searching for hidden meanings. Because for the first time in a very long time, his words sounded different. Not defensive. Not persuasive. Not urgent. Simply responsible. She closed her eyes. Took a slow breath. A year earlier, those words would have been everything she had prayed to hear. Now, they felt like something else. Not a rescue. Not an ending. A truth. And truth, even when it arrives late, still matters. She wasn't angry anymore. But neither was she the woman who once believed love alone could carry two people. She understood something now that neither of them had understood before. Sometimes people don't lose each other because there wasn't enough love. They lose each other because understanding arrived. After survival had already replaced hope. He finally found the courage to speak. She finally found the peace to choose from freedom instead of fear. Whether they would find each other again was no longer the most important question. The more important question was this: if love ever returned, could two people who had finally learned the cost of taking each other for granted choose differently this time? Because wanting someone back is not the same as being ready to love them well. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson hidden inside every sincere apology. The goal is never simply to return to the person you lost. It is to become someone who would never ask them to carry the relationship alone again. There is a common misunderstanding about what happens when a woman finally stops chasing. People assume the biggest change happens inside the relationship. It doesn't. The biggest change happens inside her. Long before anyone else notices. Long before he notices. Long before her friends notice. She begins making decisions that are no longer filtered through one question: how will this affect us? Instead, she starts asking something she hasn't asked in a very long time. How does this affect me? Not from selfishness. From self-respect. Those two things are often confused. For months, perhaps years, she had measured her own emotional weather by his. If he seemed distant, her day felt heavy. If he sounded affectionate, everything seemed brighter. If he took hours to reply, her nervous system quietly filled the silence with questions. Had she done something wrong? Was he upset? Was he losing interest? Should she text again? Should she wait? Should she explain herself differently? It was exhausting. Not because she was needy. Because uncertainty demands constant emotional labor. One unanswered message can become 20 imagined conversations. One short reply can become an entire evening of overthinking. Eventually, your own emotions stop belonging to you. They become reactions. She didn't realize that while it was happening. Most people don't. Emotional dependence rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as love. One ordinary Tuesday. She was sitting in traffic after work. Cars barely moved. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. Normally, this would have been the moment she reached for her phone. Maybe she'd send him a picture of the weather. Maybe she'd ask what he wanted for dinner. Maybe she'd simply say, "Long day." Instead, she turned on the radio. A song she'd forgotten existed began to play. She smiled. Not because the song was extraordinary. Because she actually listened to it. There was no conversation competing for her attention. No waiting. No wondering. Just music. It struck her how long it had been since she'd experienced something completely by herself. Without immediately trying to share it. That realization wasn't sad. It was surprisingly peaceful. There is a quiet difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness asks, "Who isn't here?" Solitude asks, "Who am I when I'm here alone?" For a long time, she had lived inside the first question. Now, she was slowly discovering the second. Meanwhile, he noticed something he hadn't expected. Nothing he did created the same reaction anymore. Weeks earlier, if he disappeared for a day, she would have noticed. Now, there were times she genuinely didn't. That unsettled him. Not because he wanted to manipulate her. Because for the first time, he realized her attention had never been automatic. It had always been intentional. Intentional things can stop. He sent another message. Not out of panic. Out of hope. She answered. Kindly. Warmly. But differently. There was no hidden desperation. No subtle invitation asking him to stay longer. No emotional reaching between the lines. The conversation ended naturally. He stared at the screen. Months ago, she would have asked another question to keep the conversation alive. Now, she simply wished him a good evening. That tiny difference carried enormous weight. She was no longer trying to rescue every interaction from ending. Some conversations are meant to finish. She finally trusted that. He wasn't used to that version of her. Not because she had become cold. Because she had stopped doing the emotional work for both of them. For years, she had been extending every bridge, restarting every conversation, repairing every misunderstanding, filling every silence. Now, silence remained silent unless both people decided to cross it. That changed everything. Relationships often reveal their true balance only after one person stops compensating. Imagine two people carrying a heavy table. As long as one person quietly carries 70% of the weight, the table appears balanced. The moment that person puts it down, the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. The table doesn't suddenly become heavier. Its actual weight is finally visible. That's what happened here. She hadn't stopped loving. She had stopped overcompensating. Across the following months, people around her began noticing small changes. Nothing dramatic. She arrived on time instead of apologizing for everyone else's delays. She laughed more during conversations. She stopped checking her phone every few minutes. She listened more carefully. Ironically, once she stopped obsessing over one relationship, she became more emotionally available to the rest of her life. Her friendships deepened. She visited her parents more often. She started saying yes to invitations she would have declined before. One Sunday afternoon, she joined a group hike organized by a coworker. She almost didn't go. The old version of herself would have worried. What if he calls while I'm gone? Now, the thought never appeared. She climbed slowly, stopped halfway up the trail, looked across the valley below. The air felt cool against her face. Someone beside her whispered, "It's beautiful." She nodded. It really is. No photograph. No social media story. No message saying, "You would have loved this view." She simply stood there. Present. Sometimes healing looks exactly like that. Not moving on. Simply staying where your feet already are. At the same time, he was changing too. Not as quickly. Not as visibly. But genuinely. The difference was that his growth had begun through loss. Hers had begun through return. One evening, he caught himself reaching for his phone after something funny happened at work. Without thinking, he wanted to tell her. Then he stopped. He realized something that hadn't occurred to him before. She had always been his emotional home. Every small story. Every frustration. Every success. She had listened. Asked questions. Celebrated things that seemed insignificant. He had accepted that role so naturally. He forgot homes require maintenance too. You cannot keep living inside someone's emotional safety without helping protect it. That realization stayed with him. Weeks later, they happened to meet. Not intentionally. A neighborhood bookstore. She was browsing travel guides. He almost walked away. Then she looked up. Their eyes met. For a second, neither of them moved. There wasn't anger. There wasn't dramatic longing. Only recognition. He smiled first. She smiled back. "Good to see you." "You too." Such ordinary words. Yet beneath them lived entire chapters. They talked for a few minutes. About work. Books. Her sister. His new apartment. Nothing extraordinary. Yet something extraordinary was quietly happening. Neither person was trying to control the conversation. Nobody was trying to prove they were happier. Nobody was secretly testing the other. They were simply present. When they said goodbye, he walked toward the parking lot. She continued deeper into the bookstore. Neither one looked back immediately. Several minutes later, he realized something. He wasn't proud of losing her. But strangely, he felt grateful that she had stopped chasing. Months earlier, that sentence would have sounded impossible. Now, it made perfect sense. Because if she had continued carrying the relationship, he might never have seen the truth. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't staying. It's refusing to continue hiding the imbalance. Across town, she purchased a travel journal. The cashier asked, "Planning a trip?" She smiled. "I think so. Driving home." She thought about how differently that answer would have sounded a year ago. Back then, every future plan had quietly included someone else. Now, the future felt open. Not empty. Open. There is an important difference. Empty waits to be filled. Open welcomes possibility. That evening, she unpacked the journal, ran her fingers across the blank pages. She didn't know where she'd travel. Or when. She only knew something surprising. She was making plans because she wanted them, not because she hoped someone else would join. That simple shift changed everything. Many people believe the power of the woman who stops chasing is that the man begins chasing instead. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes it doesn't. But that isn't the real transformation. Because if your happiness still depends on whether he comes back, you haven't actually stopped chasing. You've only changed direction. Real change happens when his choices stop determining your relationship with yourself. That doesn't mean you stop loving. It means love no longer requires abandoning your own center. Weeks later, she found an old notebook tucked into the back of a drawer. Inside, she had written a list years earlier. Places she wanted to visit. Books she wanted to read. Skills she wanted to learn. She laughed softly. So many of them had been postponed. Not because anyone forbade them. Because somewhere along the way, she had unconsciously decided that keeping the relationship alive deserved all of her available energy. Now, she opened the notebook. Picked one goal. Signed up for a weekend photography workshop. It wasn't life-changing. It wasn't symbolic. It was simply hers. Sometimes reclaiming yourself doesn't begin with enormous decisions. It begins with tiny permissions. Permission to rest. Permission to say no. Permission to stop explaining yourself. Permission to enjoy an afternoon without checking your phone. Permission to become interesting to yourself again. Months after they first separated, someone asked him about her. He smiled. "I hope she's doing well." They waited, expecting more. Instead, he added quietly, "I really do." Not because he had stopped loving her. Because love had finally become less possessive. He no longer wanted her happiness only if it included him. That realization surprised him. It also humbled him. At nearly the same time, a friend asked her if he wanted another chance. What would you do? She didn't answer immediately. Not because she didn't know. Because she understood the question had changed. Months earlier, she would have asked, "Does he still love me?" Now, she would ask something else. Can we build something healthier than what we had? Love alone was no longer enough. Not after everything they had learned. As she walked home that evening, the sky slowly darkened. Store lights reflected against the sidewalk after a light rain. She noticed her own reflection in a shop window. For a brief second, she saw the woman she had once been. The woman who believed loving harder could solve distance. The woman who apologized for needing reassurance. The woman who confused endurance with intimacy. She smiled gently at that version of herself. Not with embarrassment. With compassion. She had done the best she knew how to do. Then she kept walking. Not away from love. Not away from him. Toward herself. And that, more than any text he could send. More than any apology, more than any reunion, was the moment the entire dynamic truly changed. Because the woman who stops chasing doesn't become powerful because someone finally notices her worth. She becomes powerful because she notices it first. She no longer measures love by how much she can endure. She measures it by how safely she can remain herself. And once a woman discovers that kind of peace, every relationship she chooses afterward, whether with him or with someone entirely new, must be able to meet her there. By the time we reach the end of a relationship, most people are still asking the wrong question. Will he come back? It sounds like the most important question. It certainly feels like it. After all, when someone has occupied your thoughts for months, or even years, your heart naturally wants an ending that makes sense. An apology, a reunion, a second chance. Something that transforms all the pain into a beautiful conclusion. Stories have taught us to expect that. Real life is less predictable. Sometimes he comes back. Sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he returns exactly when you've stopped expecting him. Sometimes he never reaches out again. Sometimes he comes back, only to discover that the woman he left no longer exists in quite the same way. And sometimes he changes. She changes. But not in the same direction. That is the quiet truth very few people prepare us for. Healing does not happen on a synchronized schedule. One person may wake up 6 months later finally understanding everything. The other may have spent those same 6 months quietly building a completely different life. Neither person is wrong. Time simply moves through people differently. Months after his apology, their lives settled into separate rhythms. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just day by day. He still thought about her. Less often now. But more honestly. He no longer imagined impossible conversations where everything magically returned to the way it had been. Instead, he found himself wondering whether she was sleeping well, whether work had become less stressful, whether she had finally taken that photography trip she'd once talked about. The questions had changed. Earlier, his thoughts had centered around what he had lost. Now, they centered around who she was. That distinction mattered. Because love that matures becomes less possessive. It begins caring about another person's happiness. Even when you are no longer standing at the center of it. Across the city, she still thought about him too. Sometimes while folding laundry. Sometimes while walking past restaurants they used to visit. Sometimes after hearing a song she hadn't listened to in years. Memory hadn't disappeared. It had simply softened around the edges. There is something almost beautiful about the way memory changes. In the beginning, every reminder feels like a wound. Eventually, the same reminder becomes a photograph. Still meaningful. No longer bleeding. One rainy evening, she found herself looking through an old storage box. Inside were ticket stubs, birthday cards, a tiny seashell from a vacation neither of them had planned very well. She smiled. Not because she wanted to go back. Because she realized she finally could remember the relationship without immediately remembering the pain. That surprised her. Healing isn't forgetting. Healing is remembering without collapsing. She placed everything back into the box. Closed the lid gently. Returned it to the shelf. Not hidden. Not displayed. Simply. Part of her life. Not the center of it anymore. Meanwhile, he was learning something equally unexpected. He had become more attentive in every relationship around him. His parents noticed he called more often. His younger brother noticed he listened instead of interrupting. Friends noticed he asked questions and actually waited for the answers. Loss had quietly taught him presence. Not because suffering automatically makes people wiser. It doesn't. Some people repeat the same mistakes forever. Growth only happens when pain is allowed to become a teacher instead of merely a punishment. One afternoon, An older coworker invited him to lunch, somewhere between conversations about work and family. The coworker mentioned his wife. "We've been married 32 years. He smiled. "What's the secret?" The older man laughed. "I don't think there is one." Then after a pause, "Although I will tell you something I learned far too late." He waited. The man stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "Never assume someone will keep giving what you've stopped noticing." The sentence landed with unexpected force. It sounded simple, yet it seemed to contain everything he wished he had understood years earlier. He carried those words home with him. Across town, she had begun mentoring a new employee at work. The young woman reminded her of herself. Always apologizing. Always worried about disappointing everyone. One afternoon, the younger woman apologized 3 times during a single conversation. She smiled gently. "You know." The younger woman looked embarrassed. "What?" "You don't have to earn the right to exist in every room." The words came naturally. Only afterward did she realize she had been speaking to her younger self as much as anyone else. Months ago, she would have never believed she'd become the person offering that kind of reassurance. Because back then, she had been desperately searching for reassurance herself. Sometimes, the lessons that nearly break us become the ones we quietly pass on. One Saturday morning, their paths crossed again. Not by arrangement. Just coincidence. A local farmer's market. She was choosing peaches. He was buying flowers for his mother. This time, the surprise felt different. Comfortable. Neither of them froze. Neither of them panicked. Life had continued moving. So had they. "Hi. Hi." They laughed softly at how ordinary that sounded. He looked at the peaches in her basket. "Still picking the ones that aren't perfectly round?" She smiled. "You remembered." "I remember a lot more now." There was no bitterness in his voice. Only honesty. She nodded. "I know." For a few moments, they walked together through the market, talking about small things. Books. Travel. Work. Weather. The conversation wasn't trying to become anything larger. That made it strangely peaceful. As they reached the parking lot, they stopped. Neither seemed eager to rush away. Yet neither tried to hold the other there. Finally, he spoke. "I've wondered sometimes." She looked at him. "Whether we met again too late." She didn't answer immediately. Not because she didn't know. Because some questions deserve silence before words. Then she smiled. "I don't think it was too late." He looked surprised. "I think." She searched for the right sentence. "That we just needed different versions of ourselves before we could understand what happened." The wind moved gently through the trees above them. People carried shopping bags past without noticing the conversation unfolding beside them. He nodded slowly. "I wish I'd understood sooner." "I know. I really am sorry." "I know that too." Then, something remarkable happened. Neither of them cried. Neither of them tried to rewrite history. Neither asked, "What if?" Because sometimes, peace is not created by finding the perfect ending. It is created by no longer needing one. They hugged. Briefly. Gently. The kind of embrace shared between two people who had once carried each other's entire worlds. Then, they stepped back. Life rarely announces its turning points. Often, they look exactly like that. An ordinary parking lot. Two people smiling sadly. A quiet goodbye that doesn't feel like abandonment anymore. As she drove away, she noticed something curious. Her chest didn't ache. She wasn't forcing herself to stay strong. She simply felt grateful. Grateful that someone she had once loved so deeply had finally become honest. Grateful that she had survived becoming invisible. Grateful that she had found herself before someone else's return could define her future. At a red light. She caught herself humming along with the radio. The light turned green. She kept driving. No dramatic tears. No cinematic ending. Just another afternoon. Sometimes. That is what healing actually looks like. For him. The drive home felt unexpectedly calm. Years earlier, he would have measured the conversation by one question. Did I get another chance? Now, that question seemed strangely incomplete. Because somewhere along the journey, he had realized another truth. Loving someone well is not measured only by whether they choose you. Sometimes, loving someone well means accepting the life they have built without asking them to dismantle it for your comfort. That realization hurt. But it also brought peace. Several months passed. Winter slowly became spring. The city changed almost without anyone noticing. Trees that had stood bare for months quietly filled with leaves again. People ate lunch outside. Windows stayed open longer. Life continued doing what life has always done. Moving. One evening, she attended a friend's engagement party. Someone asked if she was seeing anyone. She smiled. Not right now. Worried about falling in love again. She thought for a moment. No. Really? She laughed softly. I'm not afraid of love anymore. What are you afraid of then? She looked around the room. People laughing. Music playing. Candles glowing against the windows. I'm only afraid of forgetting myself again. That answer surprised even her. Because it wasn't born from bitterness. It was born from clarity. She still believed in love. She simply no longer believed love required self-abandonment. Around the same time, he found himself beginning a new relationship. Slowly. Carefully. Very different from before. On one of their early dates, the woman he was seeing apologized for talking too much. He smiled. You don't have to apologize for taking up space. As soon as he said it, he remembered another woman. Another time. Another version of himself who hadn't known how important those words could be. He silently thanked the lesson, even though it had cost him dearly. There is a temptation, when telling stories like this, to insist on one ending. To tell you that they found each other again. Or to tell you they never spoke again. Life is rarely that obedient. Some people reunite. Some don't. Some become strangers. Some become friends. Some remain quiet chapters inside each other's hearts forever. There is no universal ending. Only honest ones. Maybe they built a new relationship years later. Maybe they didn't. Maybe she eventually met someone who loved her with the consistency she had always offered. Maybe he became the kind of partner he once needed to become. Both are possible. Because this story was never really about predicting what happened next. It was about understanding what had already changed. The woman who once chased no longer believed that love meant convincing someone to stay. The man who once assumed she always would no longer believed consistency should be taken for granted. Whether their roads crossed again became almost secondary, because the greatest transformation had already happened. They had both stopped asking love to compensate for the parts of themselves they had neglected. Perhaps that is why the question, does he come back, is never quite the right one. A better question might be, who have I become by the time the answer arrives? Because sometimes he returns. Sometimes he doesn't. But if your healing depends entirely on which of those futures unfolds, then your heart is still waiting at the same closed door. Real freedom begins the day you quietly unlock that door from the inside. You step outside. You breathe deeply. You thank the person you once were for surviving. And then, whether someone is walking toward you or walking away, you continue walking too. Not because love no longer matters, but because at last, you have remembered that your own life does. For a long time, she believed love had to be earned. Not consciously. No one had ever sat her down and said those words. Life simply taught her that being needed felt safer than simply being loved. So she became the one who remembered birthdays. The one who apologized first. The one who checked in. The one who noticed changes in someone's voice before they admitted they were hurting. The one who stayed after everyone else had gone home. She became extraordinarily good at loving. She just wasn't very good at asking whether love was being returned. That is how many people lose themselves. Not through one catastrophic decision, but through thousands of tiny moments where another person's comfort quietly became more important than their own. She didn't see it happening, because sacrifice often disguises itself as devotion. And devotion, when it is one-sided for too long, becomes another name for loneliness. For years, she believed the goal was simple. If she loved deeply enough, patiently enough, consistently enough, one day he would finally understand. One day he would realize her value. One day he would choose her the way she had already chosen him. It was a beautiful hope. It was also the reason she stayed exhausted for so long. Because love cannot survive when it is built entirely around a future version of someone. It can only live inside who they are today. That truth arrived quietly. Not during an argument. Not after a dramatic goodbye. But months later, while she was watering the small plants on her apartment balcony. The afternoon sun warmed the concrete. Birds landed briefly on the railing before flying away again. She noticed one of the plants had begun growing new leaves. For weeks, it had looked almost lifeless. She had nearly thrown it away. Instead, she had changed where it sat. A little more sunlight. A little less water. A little more patience. Now, new green leaves reached toward the light. She smiled. Not because the plant reminded her of him. Because it reminded her of herself. Nothing about the plant had been broken. It had simply spent too long in an environment where it couldn't thrive. How often do people mistake the wrong environment for personal failure? How often do they believe, if only I loved harder? When perhaps the real question is, am I being loved in a way that allows me to grow? That afternoon, she wrote those words in her journal, then closed it. She didn't need to reread them. She already knew they were true. Across town, he was discovering a different kind of truth. One evening, he visited his parents. His father was repairing an old wooden chair. The legs had loosened over the years. Without saying much, his father carefully removed each screw, adjusted the joints, applied fresh glue, then patiently waited before tightening everything again. Watching him work, he asked, "Why not just tighten the screws?" His father smiled without looking up. Because if the frame underneath is loose, tightening the screws only hides the problem for a little while. The sentence lingered in the room. Relationships are not so different. Flowers cannot repair neglect. Grand apologies cannot replace years of emotional absence. A promise cannot support a relationship whose foundation has quietly cracked over time. The structure itself has to change. For the first time, he understood why she hadn't immediately run back after his apology. She wasn't rejecting him. She simply wasn't willing to rebuild the same house using the same broken blueprint. That realization hurt. But it also felt strangely hopeful. Because real change was finally possible. Not because it guaranteed another chance. Because it guaranteed he would never love the same careless way again. Weeks passed. Spring settled fully into the city. The trees outside her apartment now carried thick green leaves. Neighbors opened windows. Children played later into the evening. Life continued unfolding with quiet confidence. She noticed something one morning while making coffee. She couldn't remember the last time she had imagined a conversation with him inside her head. That startled her. Not because she had forgotten him. Because she had stopped needing imaginary closure. There are seasons when our minds replay conversations that never happened. We rehearse apologies, arguments, perfect explanations, perfect endings. Eventually, if healing continues, those conversations simply stop arriving. Not because every question has been answered, because your life becomes too full to keep living inside imagined versions of the past. She carried her coffee to the balcony, watched the neighborhood slowly wake up. Someone walked a golden retriever across the street. An elderly woman watered flowers outside her front gate. A delivery driver hummed softly while unloading boxes. Nothing extraordinary. Yet everything felt quietly complete. Peace rarely announces itself. It usually arrives disguised as an ordinary Tuesday morning. Months later, a close friend asked her, "Do you think you still love him?" She thought carefully. Love deserved honesty. "I think," she smiled thoughtfully, "I'll probably always care about him." The friend nodded. But caring about someone and belonging with them aren't always the same thing. The sentence surprised both of them. It wasn't cynical. It wasn't defensive. It was simply mature. Sometimes love remains, even after compatibility disappears. Sometimes gratitude remains, even after goodbye. Sometimes forgiveness remains, even when reunion does not. Growing up emotionally often means learning to hold those truths without forcing them to become simpler. Meanwhile, his own life continued changing. He volunteered to mentor new employees. He became more patient with his family. He apologized sooner. He listened longer. He no longer viewed vulnerability as losing. He viewed it as participation. One afternoon, his younger cousin asked him for relationship advice. He almost laughed. The younger version of himself would have offered strategies. Timing. Texting rules. Who should call first? Now, his answer sounded completely different. If someone keeps telling you they feel alone. He paused. Don't argue with their feelings. The cousin frowned. What do you mean? He looked out the window for a long moment. If someone you love says they're lonely while standing beside you, don't spend your energy proving they shouldn't feel that way. Instead, ask what they've been carrying by themselves. The cousin nodded slowly. He hoped those words would save someone else years of unnecessary regret. One evening, she attended a small art exhibition with co-workers. Nothing formal. Just local artists displaying paintings in an old renovated warehouse. She wandered slowly through the gallery. One painting stopped her. It showed two boats floating on the same ocean. Neither was tied to the other. Yet both were sailing toward the horizon beneath the same sky. There was enormous space between them. And still, the painting felt deeply connected. The small description beneath the artwork read, "Love is not ownership. It is the freedom to become fully yourself while choosing to travel beside another." She stood there for several minutes. Those words settled gently into places inside her that once would have resisted them. Years earlier, she would have believed love meant never drifting apart. Now, she understood something different. Healthy love is not two people disappearing into each other. It is two whole lives learning how to walk together without asking either person to disappear. That evening, she bought a postcard print of the painting, framed it, hung it beside her desk. Not because it reminded her of someone else, because it reminded her of herself. Summer arrived. The anniversary of their breakup quietly passed. Neither of them noticed until days later. That alone revealed how much had changed. There had once been a time when every date carried emotional weight. Now, life contained too many meaningful moments to revolve around a single painful one. One afternoon, they unexpectedly met again. Not in a bookstore. Not at a market. But at a charity event organized by mutual friends. There were conversations. Music. Children laughing in the distance. People carrying donated boxes toward waiting trucks. When they saw each other, they smiled. Warmly. Naturally. There was no tension left to protect. No invisible battle waiting beneath polite conversation. He walked over. "It's good to see you." "You too." They talked for a while. About work. Her upcoming photography trip. His volunteer projects. At one point, they found themselves standing quietly beside each other watching children paint colorful murals on large wooden boards. One little girl dipped her brush into bright yellow paint, then accidentally splattered it across her own shoes. She burst into laughter. The adults laughed too, watching the scene. He spoke almost absent-mindedly. "I used to think love was about never making mistakes." She looked at him. "And now?" He smiled softly. "I think it's about noticing the small hurts before they become permanent." She nodded. "I think you're right." There was no need to say more. Some understandings no longer require explanation. As the event ended, people began saying goodbye. He looked at her. "I hope life is good to you." She answered without hesitation. "It already is." The words carried no hidden message. No comparison. No invitation. Only truth. He smiled. "I'm glad." And she believed him. Perhaps that was the greatest evidence of how much both of them had grown. Trust had returned. Not the trust required for romance. The quieter trust that recognizes genuine goodwill. As she walked toward her car, she realized something beautiful. For the first time, she didn't feel like the woman who had been left. She didn't even feel like the woman who had healed. She simply felt like herself. Labels eventually become unnecessary. Healing eventually becomes identity. Across the parking lot, he watched her leave. Not with longing. Not with regret alone. But with gratitude. Some people enter our lives to stay forever. Others stay long enough to teach us the lessons we were unwilling to learn any other way. Both kinds of love matter. Both deserve respect. As the sun lowered across the evening sky, their paths separated once more. Perhaps forever. Perhaps only until another ordinary day years from now. It no longer mattered. Because neither of them was waiting anymore. And that is where this story finally reveals its deepest truth. People often believe the greatest power belongs to the person who makes someone chase after them. But that was never the real power. The real power was never silence used as punishment. Never emotional distance designed to create longing. Never becoming unavailable simply to appear valuable. Those things are still forms of chasing. Only disguised. Real power is much quieter. It is waking up one morning and realizing your worth no longer rises and falls according to someone else's attention. It is learning that love should feel like a place where both people can rest. Not a stage where one person performs while hoping to be chosen. It is understanding that the healthiest relationships are not built by one person constantly proving their devotion, but by two people repeatedly choosing each other through ordinary days. Real love is not measured by who texts first, who apologizes first, who sacrifices more. Real love is measured by whether both people feel emotionally safe enough to remain fully themselves. That is the kind of love that survives ordinary life. That is the kind of love that grows quietly instead of demanding constant proof. And that, more than making someone chase, is the greatest power anyone can ever discover. Because once you know your own value, you stop asking love to convince you that you have one. You simply meet another person. Heart open. Hands unclenched. Ready to walk beside them. Never ahead. Never behind. And never again carrying two hearts alone.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.